Today's discussion is going to be about the Northeast because you're an expert of Northeast and how our neighborhood is in a turmoil and how are they impacting the Northeast right now.
That's a strategic point. The Northeast was hugely important. It was hugely important to gain access to Southeast Asia, but also to counter China. But that doesn't mean that it isn't a weak point.
China's got a influence in this region as well with their rail line coming up, which is going to be $8.9 million. Anything that happens in Bangladesh or Myanmar directly affects the Northeast.
Bigger problems and accusations in the Manipur conflict was the unvetted entry of Myanmarese refugees coming in who were then settling down in forest lands, changing the demography of the state and indulging in drug peddling and poppy cultivation. There were sanctions that were made early on the Rapid Action Battalion, which is the paramilitary elite force in Bangladesh, on leadership of the RAB. Muhammad Yunus was planted by the Americans. Nobody will accept that.
The fall of Bangladesh was the West teaching India a lesson. I didn't understand what lesson you're talking about.
There was a time when ISI used to support their training in Bangladesh. Their main agenda was to be able to create disturbances in this region. There's about maybe 20% of the population that's always been pro-Pakistan,
Yes,
which would automatically mean anti-India. There's been a population that the Jamaat controls. Here's my concern, and this is what I consider interference of the West.
While there's a lot of internal situation in the region of Northeast India, there's a lot of threat that comes from our neighboring borders of Bangladesh and Myanmar. To understand this, we have with us Rami Niranjan Desai, an author, an anthropologist, and a scholar on the subject of Northeast India. We talk about the conflicts in Myanmar and Bangladesh, China's rising influence, and Trump 2.0 and its implication in the region of Southeast Asia. This is an insightful conversation to understand the implications for India. So without further ado, let's get started. Before we dive into today's conversation, I want to take a quick moment and ask for a favor. We noticed that 93% of you who watch our content regularly aren't subscribed yet. My promise to you is simple. If you hit that subscribe button, we'll keep working hard to bring thought-provoking conversations, incredible guests, and the topics you really care about the most. It is practically free for you, but it makes a huge difference for us, helping us grow, reach more people, and bring even better content your way. Thank you for supporting. It means the world to us. Now let's get back to the video. Rami Niranjan Desai, welcome to Dive Publisher, ma'am. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a long time pending, so I'm glad we made it.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Today's discussion is going to be about the Northeast because you're an expert of Northeast and how our neighborhood is in a turmoil and how are they impacting the Northeast right now. But to begin with, I want to understand your connection to the Northeast, ma'am. Where did you develop this connection? Because it's quite unusual to find someone who really understands Northeast.
Well, let me say this, that Northeast is very fashionable right now. I think a lot of people are showing a greater interest in knowing the Northeast, traveling to the Northeast. Just the sheer amount of restaurants that have opened in Delhi. If you go to Himayupur, I mean, it's incredible. We never had anything like this before. And one of the reasons was that there was a psychological distance as well as a geographical distance to the Northeast from the rest of the country. By which I mean that because it was so difficult to go to the Northeast, the only point of entry usually used to be Guwahati. And then from Guwahati, you went into other states. And it was very expensive for most people to travel because there weren't any direct flights. And even flights to Guwahati were far and few. There was insurgency. Everybody knew the Northeast from the lens of Ulfa.
Yeah.
So people were hesitant to go there and explore the Northeast, which, if you look at it from their point of view, of course, nobody would want to go for tourism to a place which has security concerns. So the only people who used to go there were people who were in tea plantations, who were maybe in the defense forces. Otherwise, a local person wouldn't go there. So we didn't know much about it. That created a psychological deficit because it was like an entire region, and it's not a small place. It's like saying South India, saying the Northeast is like saying South India or North India. It has 7 states.
So diverse.
So diverse. Each state has its own character, its own ethnic makeup, its own cuisine, its own climate, so on and so forth. It was very different, but we just never went there. So when I was younger, it was a question in my head as to why nobody ever went to the Northeast. Why did we know nothing about it? We didn't even have kids in school who were from the Northeast, really. And if somebody was from Assam, it was an exotic thing. Not that we came from a time when there wasn't this sort of social media where all of this sort of differences were thrust in your face. It was very innocent that, oh, somebody's coming from Assam. It's so far. That's all you would say.
Absolutely.
But over a period of time, there was a racial angle that came to it.
True.
There was an economic angle that came to it. There were security concerns. And I used to wonder, why isn't anybody studying it? Why are we not traveling there? Why is there so much of insurgency there? Because that's all we hear about it. And that's what interested me into the Northeast. It was a road less traveled, so as to say. It was a terrain that was difficult, and that was exciting for me.
So is this a curiosity in you about Northeast, is it?
It was a curiosity added with the fact that I wanted to study conflicts, and I wanted to understand conflicts that also had layers of religion. Northeast had all of that. It had religion, it had race, it had conflict, it had insurgency, it had separatist movements. And I wanted to understand how and when it became like this, because it certainly wasn't like this in ancient India. In our history books, you will see a lot of mention of kingdoms and princes and kings and the kind of wealth that they brought, the kind of culture that they had, the kind of lineages that they came from. Even in the Mahabharata, if you read the Udyog Parv. In the Udyog Parv, there's a list of the gifts that were given to the Pandavas after they won the war. And the king of Pragjotishpur was said to have supported the Kauravas. And so there is this sort of ancient mention, there is this sort of high connectivity. Arjun is supposed to have married the princess of Manipur, Ulupi, some say Chitrangada as well. Hidimba is supposed to be the princess and the ruler of Dimapur. So tribes from there still believe that they come from the lineage of Hidimba and Ghatotkacha. Bhim is to have traveled there. If you go to Dimapur, there's an archaeological site which has huge sizes of stone-carved chessboard and the pegs, So it has this life, and they say that because Hidimba and Ghatotkacha were supposed to be monsters and very large in size, this was their chessboard.
Okay.
Rukmani, they say, came from one of the tribes in Arunachal Pradesh. There's a Parshuram Kund in Arunachal Pradesh. You look at Kamakhya Mataji temple, it's older than time. So there has been this sort of connectivity, there has been this sort of referencing in our history. And then suddenly it got cut. So that was the curiosity that really interested me, and also the fact that it was such a layered conflict.
So what was the first step to understanding Northeast better?
Traveling there.
Traveling there.
Of course, I studied theology, I studied anthropology of religion. That gave me the academic qualifications to be able to associate with organizations that were willing to send me there or help me with my research in these areas. But I am of the firm belief that you cannot understand such complex regions, and all regions are complex, even for a person who doesn't understand the Northeast. If we were doesn't understand north of India, if you were to send him to the Mahakumbh, it would be a daunting experience.
True.
For him. So all places are complex. Some places a little bit more than the others, because just of the amount of factors that influence it, or maybe the geographical location of it, like in the case of the Northeast, because we have such large open borders. But apart from that, doing field work is hugely important. So I lived there for 2 years, apart from the fact that...
Where did you live in?
I lived in Guwahati, because in those days, Guwahati was the safest place
to live
in, and then also the most well-connected transportation-wise. So from Guwahati, then you could travel to different places.
An army base is also there in Guwahati.
Correct, but most of my research, of course, we used to meet people from the military as well, but most of your research is amongst the villagers, amongst the tribals, people who have been impacted, amongst the insurgents themselves. So that is where real research happens, because if you don't understand how the locals are being impacted, or why they support certain things, are unsupported of certain groups, or how politics plays a role, you don't get a full picture.
Have you always been welcomed, felt welcomed when you go to any?
Not initially.
Not initially.
Let's be very, very candid about that. It's not an easy place to break into, because people come from the understanding that you know nothing. So it took a lot of time for me, and it came out of the fact that I spent time there. Wherein people start believing that I'm serious about my work,
Yes.
that I do know stuff. Even right now, when dissenters, people who don't agree with my opinion, want to put me down, it'll be like, oh, you're not from here, what do you know? I mean, I don't need to be from anywhere to know that place.
True.
Otherwise, we'll never be commenting on anything except ourselves.
Yeah.
So that's absolutely ludicrous, and I think it immediately shows me how biased and possibly not very intelligent a person is when they say something like that. Like, it's utter stupidity. But apart from that, yeah, those are the hurdles you have to cross. There's
Nice.
you can make excuses
True.
for it. That's the job. And I'm sure it happens always, in not just this way that I'm going to
This
the
domain.
Northeast. If I was going to, let's say, a conflict-ridden area in Africa, maybe they'd think the same way about
Yeah,
me.
you have to gain that respect with
You have to
your
gain that
your
respect.
passion.
You have to be consistent. You have to show your discipline. You have to do the work. You have to gain the understanding, and then it's not like they're entirely wrong. I till date don't call myself an expert. Other people call me an expert on the region. They call me a scholar on the region. I don't, not out of humility, but knowing the fact.
There's more to know.
There is always more to
Yeah.
know. The minute you say I know everything, then move out.
Yeah.
You have nothing more to learn.
Yeah, it's inspiring how curiosity took you to Northeast, and now you're developing on it on a daily basis. I would like to switch our conversation now to the more geopolitics to understand the region better. But to understand the region better, I'd like to put you notice that our neighborhood has been in turmoil for the last few years. Man, we see situations in Afghanistan. Our relationship isn't the best with Maldives, Sri Lanka. There's a new government. Bangladesh, we know there's the ousting of PM Sheikh Hasina, and there has been a situation in Myanmar as well. What is your take on our neighborhood policy right now, and what do you think is going wrong?
See, I don't think there's anything going wrong with our neighborhood first policy. And I think we proved that very efficiently during our COVID outreach, when we supplied a lot of these countries with the kind of medicines that they required, with the vaccines, with the COVID vaccines, and then furthermore with basic necessities. So I think we did a really good job and gained a lot of goodwill from people on the ground. So if you go to Sri Lanka, you meet the locals there, they love India because they realize the kind of neighbors that we've been. We've been good neighbors. We've never interfered internally with their politics. During times of need, we've realized what they've wanted, whether it was the COVID vaccines, whether it was extending loans or helping them get loans during their own
financial crisis.
economic turmoil. In Bangladesh, I know Bangladesh well. There is a platform that we have from the organization that I'm associated with called the Silchar Sylhet Festival, where we aim at bringing what was considered, these are twin cities, Silchar and Sylhet, and they were divided during the partition. A lot of people have their ancestral homes this side. A lot of them have their old family memories on the other side. And they've always shared great relations. Through this platform, we bring them together and we talk about, and we bring stakeholders together and we talk about how we can create the kind of interconnectivity, trade that was there previously.
Before.
And how we can build upon that existing relationship. There are a lot of things that Indians do, individually, organizations do, to bring countries like Bangladesh closer. But when you look at the government as well, I think they did a great job. We were great friends of the previous dispensation. The previous dispensation was a great friend of ours. It was at that time when insurgency started being curbed in the Northeast, because Sheikh Hasina took a very strong stance of not allowing insurgents to train on their soil. So whether it was NLFT in Tripura or ULFA, there was a time when ISI used to support their training in Bangladesh. ISI had a large footprint, as you know, in Bangladesh, and their main agenda was to be able to create disturbances in this region. When Sheikh Hasina clamped down on these terrorist organizations and insurgents, automatically it had a ripple effect on the Northeast, wherein insurgency slowly started coming down. So I think that was a result of our great relationship with Bangladesh. Even today, what has happened in Bangladesh, of course, is, as we all know, is alleged to be the hand of the Western countries led by the US. Anybody who's been looking at Bangladesh would know that for the last 2 years we've been commenting saying a regime change is happening, a regime change is happening. There was much written about it by many serious observers of Bangladesh. There were many indicators, like the American envoy to Bangladesh visiting the Election Commission office, or the US sanctioning the Rapid Action Battalion, which is their elite paramilitary force, or the US, European countries, and even countries like Australia commenting, saying that, oh, we don't believe that, or saying that the election should be fair, basically indicating that it wasn't going to be fair under Sheikh Hasina's regime. So I
But it wasn't also.
see, elections either way have their own problems in countries like this,
Yes.
whether it's her government or anybody else's government. But as good neighbors, did we interfere?
We did
didn't. And that is our job. Our job is not to interfere. Our job is to ensure that there is the kind of support that the people of these countries require, that we can extend this support, that our relationships with these countries remain strong. Of course, nobody knew an interim government headed by whom would come in, right? So who are we supposed to interact
But do you think
with?
the people of Bangladesh believes that India is there for their support?
Of course, there is this whole radical element, a fringe element that they have. I would say to the extent that there's about maybe 20% of the population that's always been pro-Pakistan,
Yes.
which would automatically mean anti-India. There's been a population that the Jamaat controls. Therefore, that's an ideology. How do you fight an ideology? But I also believe that there is a grand population in Bangladesh that really understands the importance of being secular, understands the role that India played during their struggle,
The liberation.
and how India helped them get back up on their feet. And I think that has not been forgotten. It may have been right now ignored or sidelined because of the heavy political drama that's unfolding there. And we don't know what the future holds. But has India played a good neighbor? We surely have.
Always try to be.
We've always tried to be, we've been non-interfering, even with, it's right now that our foreign secretary was in Bangladesh, and that means that our outreach is on. But until and unless Bangladesh gets its own internal situation in order, we don't know what's going to happen with the interim government, elections are going to happen or not. The only thing India can do at this point is voice their support for democracy,
For the people, yeah.
that elections should happen. You look at even the new government that's come in to Sri Lanka, they share good relations with India.
True.
Previous government, Ranil's government, they shared a good relationship with India. You look at Nepal. Nepal also has its own turmoil, but the present dispensation, shares a good relationship with India. It was only recently, I think, only about 2 weeks ago, that the foreign minister was in India, Arzu Deva, making her outreach. Also, we have people-to-people connect in all these countries. Of course, we have problems, but we've been able to navigate it well. You look at Myanmar, we have open channels of communication with all the ethnic armed organizations as well as the military junta. Pakistan is problematic, will continue to be problematic. India ignores it now.
We have been, yes.
We have been.
So we share a lot of soft power with our neighbors, and that's the holding power. Do you think that is?
I think that's a power. You're quite right when you say that we share this soft power. We share this people-to-people connect, not just in our immediate neighborhood, but right extending up to Southeast Asia, if not really up to Japan as well. I travel to Japan often. I've been there many times. You go to the temples there, and you will have the pantheon of Hindu gods. They actively worship Saraswati, they actively worship Ganeshji.
They have their interpretation of Ramayana as well.
They have the interpretation. If you go and see Buddhist places of worship in Japan, the Buddha is always surrounded by the Hindu pantheon of gods, whether it's Shiva, Vishnu, so on and so forth. There'll be deities, other deities also that we may not any longer actively worship here, but you'll see them there. You look at Thailand, Vietnam, Angkor Wat. These are obviously, what our civilizational ancestors have left for us on a platter, and I think it is our job now to make the most of it.
Got it. So what I understood from your answer here is that even these countries are in a turmoil, our neighborhood, but the people still feel India
Absolutely.
is in a goodwill for them, and even though we perceived as a big brother, there still is the Indian love for them.
Absolutely. I think that people to people connect and that friendship is very difficult to like dislodge. A political change is not going to dislodge that. I think we have a lot of goodwill, and generally, Indians are anywhere in the world a great diaspora.
Right. So, ma'am, you also mentioned that anything that happens in Bangladesh or Myanmar directly affects the Northeast. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Of course, for example, our Act East policy, right? Our Act East policy is dependent on Myanmar, is dependent on Bangladesh. That's where our interconnectivity will come. We have the Asian Trilateral Highway, which we envision going through Myanmar and connecting the rest of Southeast Asia to us. Apart from ideas of a great road trip that would make to be able to travel by road across, which would be great. I'm sure a lot of people would love to do that. Which would also garner a lot of tourism for the Northeast, because the Buddhist segment of travelers that come from Southeast Asian countries right now take a very long route, which is fairly expensive. They come in via Calcutta and then they go into central India, where the pilgrimage points are. Now, if they can come in through Manipur, they can come in through the Northeast. Not only does it increase development, it increases the tourism industry and therefore development and so on and so forth, other subsidiary industries. So it's a two-way thing. Not only do we get to have strategic links to the rest of Southeast Asia, balancing the power between the East and the West, because India lies in the center, it's an important role that India plays. But in return, we also get a lot of benefits. So there's the Asian Trilateral Highway, the Sitwe Port, and the Kaladan Multimodal Project, which will give us an alternate route to the Chicken's Neck, which, as we discussed earlier, I feel is the
Most fragile
area connecting the Northeast to the rest of the country.
India, yeah.
The Siliguri corridor is 21, 22 kilometers in width. Of course, it's highly protected, but that doesn't mean that it isn't a weak point. These are very important projects. So Kaladan Multimodal Project will go via Myanmar into Mizoram, so giving us an alternate route, so we won't be just dependent on one route. So these are very, very important projects for us. Therefore, stability in these countries is primary. And I think that is what India hopes for and always plays a role of somebody who calms the tempers down on all ends.
I was reading your article which mentioned a few things about the US and their influence in Bangladesh, or even Myanmar for that matter. But one statement that I wanted to clear out and understand better is that you said that the fall of Bangladesh was the West teaching India a lesson. I didn't understand what lesson you're talking about. What is that statement that you could...
So there have been many reasons of what is happening in the northeast frontier of India. The northeast frontier of India, we must understand it historically. The West has always seen it as a very, very important part. The frontier has always been important to the West, right from the times of the British colonialists. And that's why when the British wanted to leave India and were leaving India, they created something called the Coupland Plan, which was also called the Crown Colony Plan, which meant that they'd leave India, but the Northeast would be under direct control of the British Empire. You have to ask yourself, why would the Northeast be so important, considering it was one of the last areas that they entered into. It's far, it was a difficult terrain, it was largely of tribal makeup, which was also a difficult population for the British to contend with, because see, the Western world, which is largely the Christian world, has never understood tribal populations. The reason that they've never understood is because the Christian world converted the pagan populations in the West. So when they see tribal populations, they look at it from the same pagan lens, that these are populations that are pagan. We need to convert them to give them a better life. We need to convert them because it's our job to do so as missionaries. We need to convert them because it is a civilizing process. So this idea of civilizing somebody, they had taken upon themselves. So you have to then ask yourself, then why were they interested? They were interested because they realized that as a strategic point, the Northeast was hugely important. It was hugely important to gain access to Southeast Asia, but also to counter China. It was also a region of great natural resources, also of pagan populations that they could convert and therefore make a Christian country out of it.
Okay.
Unfortunately for them, and fortunately for us, they were quickly running out of steam, money, and the political will.
So they withdrew.
So they withdrew, and this plan never took shape. It was a stroke of luck for us because we did nothing for this plan to fail. It failed because they didn't have the money to do it. But this was a plan. This was on paper. This was something that they were very keen on. And that experience has remained with them in terms of that India's northeastern frontier is an important frontier. It's an important frontier. It's an important frontier.
Okay. In your article at First Post that you write on a weekly basis called Ramification, you also mentioned that the US had vested interest in Bangladesh. Could you explain us how?
So, of course, people have different ideas and opinions about what really happened in Bangladesh, what really even is happening next door in Myanmar. But anybody who was observing Bangladesh for a while would have known the kind of interest that they were taking in the elections that were upcoming in Bangladesh. It was a very strange sort of interest that they were taking, and it was very unnecessary for an outside nation to interfere into what would be a sovereign nation. It would be entirely unacceptable in India or any other country, let alone in their own country. So, for example, the US envoy in Dhaka was making rounds of the election commission to check how it was going to proceed. There were sanctions that were made early on the Rapid Action Battalion, which is the paramilitary elite force in Bangladesh, on leadership of the RAB, saying that there were human rights violations, which seems to be a very easy excuse to blame any intervention on. There was also rampant accusations that the elections would not be fair and free, that there would be corruption. Not that I understand how that would be any different from any of the previous elections that have happened. Sometimes in certain countries, elections may be difficult because of the vested interests and for many other reasons. Nevertheless, it is the job of the people of that country and the stakeholders, political stakeholders of that country to address that issue, not an outsider.
Yeah.
So we always knew that this would be problematic.
There was an interest of Martin's Island also that you were talking about.
Sorry, which one?
The Martin's Island that the US...
St. Martin's Island, yes, of course. There was also, that's been a historical interest that the US has had. One of the reasons being because St. Martin's Island would be a great naval base.
Yeah.
Andaman and Nicobar is our base in the Bay of Bengal, that area. About 55 kilometers away, you have the Coco Islands, which has been leased by Myanmar to
China.
So why would the Americans not be interested? It has been the theater of American positioning before also. Kissinger's time, when the Americans had sent the USS Enterprise to project itself on India, that we are there. So it's been a theater of different games before. So there's no reason why it shouldn't be now, considering that geopolitics has become so much more complicated. But nobody knew when this change would happen. One thought that it might happen before elections, but nobody knew the time, but everybody could see it coming. Anybody who sees Bangladesh close enough knew that there was a regime change that was coming, that they were building up, and they could be the deep state, they could be Western interests, were building up the foundation, the excuse to say a regime change was necessary. So it was not wrong before the elections when not just the Americans, but the European Union and the Australians, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong here, it was New Zealand as well, that said things like, Bangladesh should have fair and free elections, and we're concerned about democracy. Why would these countries be so invested in Bangladesh? So they were making the ground for a regime change, and therefore no American will accept that the interim government list was made in the US, that Muhammad Yunus was planted by the Americans. Nobody will accept that. But great observers of the region, including people from the inside, have alleged this. And they have reason to allege this. So that's the reason I said this. Number two, it has also been noted by many analysts that this could be also a way for the West to teach India a lesson for not supporting them during the Ukraine-Russia war, not supporting their stance.
Yeah.
Number three, this is an area that's going to become more and more important
Like you said.
to the world. I have always said this, and you heard what I said at the Military Literature Festival as well, that the Great Game West is done and over with. The Great Game West is Afghanistan, Pakistan, our northwestern border, in a way that's been wrapped up. There's nothing much, the Americans have left Afghanistan, the Taliban has its problems with Pakistan. It's in a state of utter chaos. Now is the time for our northeastern frontiers to be blocked. And therefore you see then the chaos in Bangladesh from that lens. You see the chaos in Myanmar. Also, I'd like to add, the West for some reason has always felt that its proximity to radical elements, Islamists, fringe elements, is something that they'll always be able to control if they have a man of their liking at the helm of things. If you look at Ashraf Ghani, everybody knew that the Americans supported him. Again, Cornell educated, so on and so forth. You look at Imran Khan, Oxford educated. You know the West supported him. Look at Muhammad Yunus, West supported. We know how he got his Nobel Prize. We know how close he was to the Clintons, to the extent that we just spoke about this, that he apparently couldn't walk or talk because he was so devastated after Hillary lost to Trump in 2016. So his leanings are also clear. However, what they don't understand is that you can't ever control an ideology. This is not a group. This is not an association of people. This is an ideology. You will not be able to curb it. Therefore, we see the situation that Bangladesh is in today. We see the fact that Muhammad Yunus, for all his qualifications, is not being able to control the radical elements, nor is he being able to control the minorities, leading to a complete situation of chaos where the minorities are not safe. The fabric of secularism has been completely sidelined. Icons of secularism and friends of India like Mujibur Rahman, statues are being torn down. His name is being removed for history books. Jamaat is taking over. There are even rumors, I think these are not misplaced rumors, where they're saying that he's going to leave the country in a bit of a rush, citing medical health problems or whatever, because eventually the people that he is courting right now, they're going to turn on him. And when it's a mess enough, he's not going to be able to stay on or control Bangladesh. So, yes, I think the West has played its role and it will continue to do so in one way or another. But with the new presidency, we'll have to wait and watch what is priority for them.
True. We'll talk about that as well, but let's shift our focus to Myanmar, because similar interest comes from the US as well in Myanmar. They've got about 121 million in aid this year, and they are, there's a lot of immigration that needs to go towards the US, which has been hold at the moment, of course, because of Trump. What is the influence that US have on Myanmar?
See, the US has very actively supported the National Unity Government. National Unity Government is a government in exile, so as to say, which has brought all the ethnic armed organizations. Myanmar has a history of ethnic armed organizations because they have so many different ethnicities. They brought them under an umbrella, wherein all the ethnic armed organizations are under the political umbrella of the NUG, and all of them are of the same mandate that they need to overthrow the military junta. The military junta obviously is in control right now, but has had its share of losses because the ethnic armed organizations, as the name suggests, are armed. They are on an offensive. And the US has consistently supported them with financial aid. So they've supported NUG, and then NUG then further distributes the money. NUG stands for democracy, which is something that India has always supported, and I think anybody with half an iota of intelligence would support the idea of democracy. But we have to understand this a bit deeper. It's not as simple as it looks, because the Constitution of Myanmar reserves 25% of the seats for the Tatmadaw, which is the military. So there's never been a point in history where the military has not been involved in the politics of Myanmar. Now, with the US supporting the NUG, I have my concerns. I think it's great. Last year, I think they sanctioned $240 million. This year, they brought it down to 120. So we have to wait and watch and see, are they going to sanction more money? NUG has offices a stone's throw away from Washington, D.C., from the White House. It has offices in other European capitals as well. So obviously they're being supported in certain ways by the West. The West has also put sanctions on the junta. So that also is an example of how the West is a part of this chaos in Myanmar. But here's my concern, and this is what I consider interference of the West, is that you can support who you want to, and democracy is always a great idea to support. But apart from overthrowing the Tatmadaw, none of the ethnic armed organizations have anything in common with each other. They all hope for autonomy, some amount of autonomy, but there isn't a common agenda that if they do get power, what are they going to do? There's no common agenda.
Democracy should be the agenda.
Democracy, of course, is, but if they want autonomy and if they don't get along with each other, then democracy doesn't work, as we have seen. It hasn't, unfortunately. So it would probably spiral it into further chaos, which I'm not quite sure the West sees it as we do. The other problem is that we also see some amount of missionary activity. We know that the Chin state is completely converted to Christianity. We know recently the Chin groups, insurgent groups, have split into two different sections. So there are a couple of groups that support one section, couple of groups that support the other section. To mediate between them, organization from Helsinki came all the way down and did the mediation between the two groups. Why would they be so interested?
Who got them to do that?
They did.
Okay.
Their initiative. But obviously they must be in touch with the Christian ethnic armed organizations to have this sort of interest, to make this sort of effort. Of course, it's in the name of conflict resolution and it's something that they say that they've been interested in. But still, it's a far-fetched idea that you'd come to mediate between Chin groups, possibly when you yourself don't have any experience
Like you said
in
before.
this sort of a complex conflict. Obviously, the other part has been that there have been refugees who have been going to Myanmar, going to the US. Now with Trump's very straight up stance on the anti-immigration policy that he is obviously going to activate, a lot of people who had already given their interviews, and there's a program which is the temporary refugee program that you can go to the US. So you're a refugee, so you get temporary safe haven. A lot of people had done all the paperwork, the interviews had happened, and they were now just waiting for their visas. I do believe that that is going to be stalled. There are 90,000 refugees on the Indo-Thailand border already who have been there since the 80s, since the conflict then. There are another 45,000 approximately that have been added since this conflict. In India itself, when we talk about the Northeast and what the impact on the Northeast would be, it would be the fact that you would have, because we have such huge porous borders, 1,643 kilometers with Myanmar alone, that we would have this sort of transnational ethnic ties that welcomes a lot of refugees from the other side, because there are these transnational ethnic ties. So they say, and of course the numbers must have changed since I checked it last, but there are already about 60 to 90,000 refugees in Delhi. Apart from that, one of the problems in Manipur was this unvetted sort of refugees coming in. Mizoram had some amount of registration, which till last year was about 50,000 people. Manipur didn't even have a registration. Now it's easier for them to come in, A, because it's close by, but the other reason is it has cousin tribes on this side. But the third reason is we had what was called the free movement regime. Respecting that there are transnational ethnic ties, 16 kilometers either way you could go in without requiring a visa. However, without any sort of facility to be able to track the people coming in, it was impossible to know if they were going back out or not. Therefore, one of the bigger problems and accusations in the Manipur conflict was the unvetted entry of Myanmarese refugees coming in who were then settling down in forest lands, changing the demography of the state, and indulging in drug peddling and
And
poppy
terrorism.
cultivation.
So that's how Manipur's impacted as well with this conflict.
Manipur's impacted, Mizoram's impacted, all the border states would be impacted. It's not just about Manipur, Mizoram, there'd be Arunachal and so on. All of the states would be impacted, but because they have similar tribes on this side, those states would be impacted a lot more. And drugs is a huge problem in the region, in the Northeast. So that is something that people are obviously hypersensitive about, and not just the people, but also government of India. The highest rate of AIDS used to be in Manipur till it shifted to Mizoram, and the reason was because of syringe usage, heroin usage. So obviously, the war against drugs is a priority for the government of India. In 2016 or 17, there was a meeting that was presided over by the Honorable Home Minister of India, where a directive was given to all the chief ministers to go full on against drug trafficking. Now, obviously, if something like this happens, where you have people coming in, you can't vet them, they're indulging in all of this is going to be not just a security problem for us, but also a health problem.
Ma'am, in your article, you also mentioned that the China's got a influence in this region as well with their rail line coming up,
Yeah.
which is going to be $8.9 million. Does that impact us, India?
So, I don't. So, of course, China has this great ambition as a part of their BRI, and they are investing on this rail line, which is going to go from Kunming to, I think, Mandalay and then further on. But you have the oil and gas pipeline as well, which is going to make probably gas the cheapest anywhere in the world. And that comes from Kunming right down to Shakshuk port, which is their deep sea port. So they have huge investments. They also have a problem, which is that in the northern Shan state, which is the border that meets China, they have a huge security issue with the cyber scam units that are running there. So the cyber scam units in Shan state hire Chinese employees because it's the closest. And Shan state also has people of the same descent, Han descent. So they employ these people. So they say they're working in a software company. They get out these ads for jobs. And when these kids come in, they realize it's a cyber slavery sort of scam, and they're being made to make these scams. Because it's in Chinese, the first place that it's launched is in China. The testing of the scams happens, the scams happen in China. So they already have a problem there. Now, this is obviously being controlled by the mafia gangs there, the drug lords there. So for them, that is really problematic because, as you know, China has a one-child policy, and if their children are being kidnapped and used in places like this, they would have a backlash. So there's been a crackdown against that with the support of the Ecuador. And further on, there has also been there's also been a joint security venture company that has been proposed by China to give security to their assets in collaboration with the military junta. So the military junta and the Chinese will have books in Myanmar. But that's essentially not to aid the Tatmadaw against the ethnic armed organizations, but to protect their assets because they're spending a hell of a lot of money. Now, how will it impact India? I think a greater question should be, how is Myanmar going to regain stability? I don't think the Chinese are particularly interested in really bothering us in the northeastern frontier. I think what probably matters to them a lot more is the West having stakeholding in Myanmar. So, for example, one of the things that the reason that they started negotiations with ethnic armed organizations as well was because the EOs were becoming close to the US and they didn't want that. So, for them, their concern is the Western imprint in Myanmar. In my opinion, not India so much, and especially in the light of the changing circumstances between India and Myanmar, where the relationship has thawed. They're not going to really be interested in meddling. Of course, people can say, oh, look, we found Chinese weapons, we found this. But the world's biggest second-hand weapon market is there. You find weapons from everywhere. You find weapons from Afghanistan also. You find weapons from Pakistan. You find weapons from China. You find all sorts of weapons. I don't think that's greatly an indicator in this day and age. But we do have a reason to be suspicious, is because the longest running insurgency in India, which was called uh, the Naga insurgency, which was led by NSCN, the training was done in China, in the Yunnan region. So they had walked all the way, the insurgents, to China, stayed there, I think, a year or so, and come back with the training that was provided there and weapons that was provided then, paraphernalia, propaganda material that was provided there. So because there has been a history of China destabilizing the Northeast, we do have reason to remain alert, to be suspicious. But if we were to judge it on a day-to-day basis, I don't think China is interfering with the Northeast at this point.
What needs to be done in order to safeguard ourselves from threats from Myanmar and Bangladesh?
I think that's a good question because that would require some amount of predictive analysis as to what is going to happen.
Now, how that, but we know that the dynamic is going to change because Trump has come into power, but this month.
See, we'll have to see if Trump is going to be interested in funding any of these groups. We do know he has a distaste for Islamists as well. We know that he understands the threat that comes from uh, these radical elements from countries like this. So we'll have to see if he wants to be involved. For him, America comes first. And I think the law and order situation just said terrible luck with the first buyers that we're seeing today. Their internal issues of unstable political sort of environment,
Wars in West Asia.
wars in West Asia, the money that they've been pumping it, inflation, the kind of debt that students who go to college come out with. These are their daily problems. I think he's going to tackle those first. And I think that's going to make a lot of people in this neighborhood a little nervous who depended on that sort of support. Whether it was for projection or whether it was for finances or whether it was for political support. Now, we'll have to wait and see what Trump does. But I think what we really need to do is we need to really be alert with the kind of infiltration that is happening. We already know, for example, in Bangladesh, over 28 previously termed as previously who had been arrested on accounts of terror activities in the Northeast were released from Bangladesh jails. And these guys had been arrested during Sheikh Hasina's tenure when there was a crackdown against terrorists, especially terrorists who were operating in the Northeast region. And the fact that they've been released just shows how much pressure the Yunus government is, interim government is, under the pressure of radical elements. It has also been noted, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the number is 8 or 5 of Ansarullah Banga team operatives who have already been caught in Assam. They have been caught in Tripura also. So these insurgents have already started coming in. We know that ABT is an Al-Qaeda affiliate. We know that Rahmani, the leader of ABT, made statements saying that we will call upon Mamta to separate West Bengal and make it a part of Bangladesh. We call upon our friends to cut the chicken's neck off. These are really provocative statements, and the fact that they're being allowed from Bangladesh soil tells us a very grim story of the future until and unless elections happen. I think it's hugely important in Bangladesh for elections to happen and let the best man win, whether it's BMP, whether it's Awami League, or whoever else it is. But I think what people have also realized in Bangladesh is allowing the extremists to control politics in Bangladesh is not going to fare well, or the Bangladeshis themselves. Look at what's happened to the export industry. Look at the impact that they're going to have in the next 20 years through climate change. The river waters are turning salty. What you need right now is stable governments and governments who can assert a certain amount of power to bring back law and order so that there isn't a trust deficit of people wanting to invest in Bangladesh, which is what nobody's going to want to go to Bangladesh today. We also must realize that our borders are
The most important.
important. They are porous. People say, oh, why don't we just fence it? How the hell are you going to fence 1,643 kilometers or another over that 4,000 kilometers with Bangladesh? How are you going to fence it? Physical fencing is not possible. And like they say, the fencing is only as strong as its weakest link. So people will always find a weakest link. And they know the terrain better than anybody else. Also, a lot of places, the fencing is not possible, physical fencing, because the terrain is difficult. So what has been proposed is sort of an integrated system of fencing. So the areas that they know that illegal immigration happens from will be physically fenced, will have policing or some amount of security there, so on and so forth. Other areas would use technology to monitor the borders. But here's what I think. I think it's hugely important not for today, but for tomorrow also, for communities on the borders to be multicultural so that our borders are not uh, homogeneous to other transnational ethnic communities. For our borders to be very, for our borders to have some amount of industry, so maybe making special economic zones on the borders, which will not only encourage multiculturalism, industry, trade from other parts of the country, increasing familiarity, but also creating borders that don't belong to one person, that belong to everybody. Also, to make communities that reside on the borders, to make them realize to consistently engage with them, not just as governments, but as people, organizations, that border safety is incumbent on them. A terrorist and insurgent doesn't travel with his food, his bedding. He doesn't travel like that. He depends on the local support. He also depends on local support to protect him. So the reason a lot of times insurgents can't be identified is because he has local support where he's hiding, he's moving house to house, where he's being fed, where he can, these are safe houses where he can safeguard himself. So if these communities are nationalistic in nature, they realize the security implications not just on them but on their children as well, on other populations in other part of the country, I think we would be in good hands. And there has been examples of this. So in Tripura, there have been communities on the border who were threatened by insurgent groups, saying that you have to give us right of way. They said, certainly not. You will not get right of way because this land belongs to us and you're terrorists and this is our country. So their children were kidnapped. These communities were brave enough to say, keep our children. We will have more children. You can keep them, but we will not allow you. That's one of the ways that insurgency in Tripura broke, that the common man broke the back of insurgency in Tripura. So it is possible, it has happened. It is important that our communities on the borders realize the impact of insurgent movement and supporting them, whether it's for money or whether it's through ideology. It's not going to serve any good purpose for the nation or for these communities. Like I said, SEZs, border control, nationalist meaning, sense of belonging, and all of this cannot happen just by, and it can't happen just by itself. Everything has to happen together. So I think these are things that we must do. And I think from the government's point of view, it's important to have channels of communication open with all stakeholders because you never know who might be in power. it's important to continue the kind of humanitarian aid that we extend to these countries, because the goodwill that we enjoy in these countries from the common man is something that no Western country, no deep state can enjoy. And we need to promote that, we need to back on that, and we need to encourage that.
The way Reggie said, then you got to safeguard our borders until we can find the leadership who we can negotiate with, be it in these regions or be it with the Western countries such as the US. Ma'am, this has been a very insightful conversation for me. Learned so much about the region, which I didn't know about before. But before we go, I would like to ask you two personal questions, if you allow me. First is, if there was a piece of advice you would give to your younger self, someone who as curious as you want to learn about a region which is new, what advice would you give them?
Don't waste your time. If you can work, and I don't say don't have any private time, but I mean, don't waste your time. That understand from the very beginning what is it that you enjoy doing. Start on it at an early age, so that by the time you've reached your early 30s, you have 10 years of experience, you have 7 years of experience, you're already an expert on that. Then also, I would say don't waste your time. I would say work as hard as you can, because by the time you're an expert, you have a lot more avenues open to you.
That's great. That's beautiful, sir. That's a really valid point. The last question to today, man, I've been throwing so many questions at you. Since this podcast is about direct publisher, we should ask my guests about a book. If there's one particular book that you wish you would have read early in life and got the perspective from the book, which book would that be?
So I think you must have got this answer many times, as difficult to choose one book, because many books mean different things to you depending on what genre they're from. But one of the books that really helped me with the Northeast was S.K. Jogge's Geopolitics of Northeast India. I wish I'd read that really at the outset, because it is really a great journey which is backed by archival research, original documentation, analysis by a master himself, a journey of how Northeast became what it became. I wish I had read that before I even went to study, because I would have then known exactly what we are dealing with. Of course, there are other books that maybe just leisure reading, and I think one of my favorite series was the Adrian Mole series. I don't know if you've read that. It's by Sue Townsend, who is hilarious. So it was one of the funniest books I read, and it's a series. So I used to wait for the next book to come out, the next book to come out. So these were, and it didn't have like any great impact on me, but I enjoyed reading it very much.
That's a big impact, sir. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for this beautiful conversation and your time. It's been insightful and inspired, and I'm sure the audience took it as well.
Well, I hope the audience enjoyed it. So thank you for your time and inviting me, and it was great fun. Yeah.
We at DOAP are working really hard to take this podcast to the next level. Our guests are going to get even better. Our production quality is going to get even better. And hopefully, I'm going to get even better too. Most importantly, we are committed to being consistent and continue to do what we love the most. Until then, keep reimagining yourself and know that the power of change lies within you. Jai Hind.